Mark Twain Selected Work, Chapter 61 of The Innocents Abroad, 1869. In this place I will print an article which I wrote for the New York Herald the night we arrived. I do it partly because my contract with my publishers makes it compulsory, partly because it is a proper, tolerably accurate, and exhaustive summing up of the cruise of the ship and the performances of the pilgrims in foreign lands, and partly because some of the passengers have abused me for writing it, and I wish the public to see how thankless a task it is to put oneself to trouble to glorify unappreciative people. I was charged with rushing into print with these compliments. I did not rush. I had written newsletters to the Herald sometimes, but yet when I visited the office that day I did not say anything about writing a valedictory. I did go to the Tribune office to see if such an article was wanted, because I belonged on the regular staff of that paper, and it was simply a duty to do it. The managing editor was absent, and so I thought no more about it. That night, when the Herald's request came for an article, I did not rush. In fact, I demurred for a while, because I did not feel like writing compliments then, and therefore was afraid to speak of the cruise, lest I might be betrayed into using other than complimentary language. However, I reflected that it would be a just and righteous thing to go down and write a kind word for the Hadjis. Hadjis are people who have made the pilgrimage, because parties not interested could not do it so feelingly as I, a fellow Hadji, and so I penned the valedictory. I have read it and read it again, and if there is a sentence in it that is not fulsomely complimentary to captain, ship, and passengers, I cannot find it. If it is not a chapter that any company might be proud to have a body write about them, my judgment is fit for nothing. With these remarks, I confidently submit it to the unprejudiced judgment of the reader. Return of the Holy Land Excursionists. The Story of the Cruise. To the editor of the Herald. The steamer Quaker City has accomplished at last her extraordinary voyage and returned to her old pier at the foot of Wall Street. The expedition was a success in some respects. In some it was not. Originally it was advertised as a pleasure excursion. Well, perhaps it was a pleasure excursion, but certainly it did not look like one. Certainly it did not act like one. Anybody's and everybody's notion of a pleasure excursion is that the parties to it will of a necessity be young and giddy and somewhat boisterous. They will dance a good deal, sing a good deal, make love, but sermonize very little. Anybody's and everybody's notion of a well-conducted funeral is that there must be a hearse and a corpse, and chief mourners, and mourners by courtesy, many old people, much solemnity, no levity, and a prayer and a sermon withal. 3/4 of the Quaker City's passengers were between 40 and 70 years of age. There was a picnic crowd for you. It may be supposed that the other 1/4 was composed of young girls, but it was not. It was chiefly composed of rusty old bachelors and a child of 6 years. Let us average the ages of the Quaker City's pilgrims and set the figure down as 50 years. Is any man insane enough to imagine that this picnic of patriarchs sang, made love, danced, laughed, told anecdotes, dealt in ungodly levity? In my experience, they sinned little in these matters. No doubt it was presumed here at home that these frolicsome veterans laughed and sang and romped all day and day after day and kept up a noisy excitement from one end of the ship to the other, and that they played blind man's buff or danced quadrilles and waltzes on moonlight evenings on the quarterdeck, and that at odd moments of unoccupied time they jotted a laconic item or two in the journals they opened on such an elaborate plan when they left home, and they scurried off to their whist and euchre labors under the cabin lamps. If these things were presumed, the presumption was at fault. The venerable excursionists were not gay and frisky. They played no blind man's buff, they dealt not in whist, they shirked not the irksome journal, for alas, most of them were even writing books. They never romped, they talked but little, they never sang, save in the nightly prayer meeting. The pleasure ship was a synagogue, and the pleasure trip was a funeral excursion without a corpse. There is nothing exhilarating about a funeral excursion without a corpse. A free, hearty laugh was a sound that was not heard oftener than once in 7 days about those decks or in those cabins, and when it was heard, it met with precious little sympathy. The excursionists danced on 3 separate evenings, long, long ago. It seems an age. Quadrilles of a single set made up of 3 ladies and 5 gentlemen, the latter with handkerchiefs around their arms to signify their sex, who timed their feet to the solemn wheezing of a melodeon. But even this melancholy orgy was voted to be sinful, and dancing was discontinued. The pilgrims played dominoes when too much Josephus or Robinson's Holy Land researches or book writing made recreation necessary. For dominoes is about as mild and sinless a game as any in the world, perhaps, excepting always the ineffably insipid diversion they call croquet, which is a game where you don't pocket any balls and don't carry 'em on anything of any consequence, and when you are done, nobody has to pay, and there are no refreshments to saw off, and consequently there isn't any satisfaction whatever about it. They played dominoes till they were rested, and then they blackguarded each other privately till prayer time. When they were not seasick, they were uncommonly prompt when the dinner gong sounded. Such was our daily life on board the ship: solemnity, decorum, dinner, dominoes, devotions, slander. It was not lively enough for a pleasure trip, but if we had only had a corpse, it would have been a noble funeral excursion. It is all over now. But when I look back, the idea of these venerable fossils skipping forth on a 6 months picnic seems exquisitely refreshing. The advertised title of the expedition, The Grand Holy Land Pleasure Excursion, was a misnomer. The Grand Holy Land Funeral Procession would have been better, much better. Wherever we went, in Europe, Asia, or Africa, we made a sensation, and I suppose I may add, created a famine. None of us had ever been anywhere before. We all hailed from the interior. Travel was a wild novelty to us, and we conducted ourselves in accordance with the natural instincts that were in us, and trammeled ourselves with no ceremonies, no conventionalities. We always took care to make it understood that we were Americans. American. When we found that a good many foreigners had hardly ever heard of America, and that a good many more knew it only as a barbarous province away off somewhere that had lately been at war with somebody, we pitied the ignorance of the old world, but abated no jot of our importance. Many and many a simple community in the Eastern Hemisphere will remember for years the incursion of the strange horde in the year of our Lord 1867 that called themselves Americans, and seemed to imagine in some unaccountable way that they had a right to be proud of it. We generally created a famine, partly because the coffee on the Quaker City was unendurable, and sometimes the more substantial fare was not strictly first class, and partly because one naturally tires of sitting long at the same board and eating from the same dishes. The people of those foreign countries are very, very ignorant. They looked curiously at the costumes we had brought from the wilds of America. They observed that we talked loudly at table sometimes. They noticed that we looked out for expenses and got what we conveniently could out of a franc and wondered where in the mischief we came from. In Paris, they just simply opened their eyes and stared when we spoke to them in French. We never did succeed in making those idiots understand their own language. One of our passengers said to a shopkeeper in reference to a proposed return to buy a pair of gloves, "Allons, restez tranquille. Maybe vi cum munde." And would you believe it, that shopkeeper, a born Frenchman, had to ask what it was that had been said. Sometimes it seems to me somehow that there must be a difference between Parisian French and Quaker City French. The people stared at us everywhere, and we stared at them. We generally made them feel rather small, too, before we got done with them, because we bore down with them with America's greatness until we crushed them. And yet we took kindly to the manners and customs, and especially to the fashions of the various people we visited. When we left the Azores, we wore awful capotes and used fine-toothed combs successfully. When we came back from Tangier in Africa, we were topped with fezzes of the bloodiest hue, hung with tassels like an Indian's scalp lock. In France and Spain, we attracted some attention in these costumes. In Italy, they naturally took us for distempered Garibaldians and set a gunboat to look for anything significant in our changes of uniform. We made Rome howl. We could have made any place howl when we had all our clothes on. We got no fresh raiment in Greece. They had but little there of any kind. But at Constantinople, how we turned out! Turbans, scimitars, fezzes, horse pistols, tunics, sashes, baggy trousers, yellow slippers. Oh, we were gorgeous. The illustrious dogs of Constantinople barked their underjaws off, and even then failed to do us justice. They are all dead by this time. They could not go through such a run of business as we gave them and survive. And then we went to see the Emperor of Russia. We just called on him as comfortably as if we had known him a century or so. And when we had finished our visit, we variegated ourselves with selections from Russian costumes and sailed away again more picturesque than ever. In Smyrna, we picked up camel's hair shawls and other dressy things from Persia. But in Palestine, our splendid career ended. They didn't wear any clothes there to speak of. We were satisfied and stopped. We made no experiments. We did not try their costume, but we astonished the natives of that country. We astonished them with such eccentricities of dress as we could muster. We prowled through the Holy Land from Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, a weird procession of pilgrims, gotten up regardless of expense, solemn, gorgeous, green spectacled, drowsing under blue umbrellas, and astride of a sorrier lot of horses, camels, and asses than those that came out of Noah's Ark, after 11 months of seasickness and short rations. If ever those children of Israel and Palestine forget when Gideon's band went through there from America, they ought to be cursed once more and finished. It was the rarest spectacle that ever astounded mortal eyes, perhaps.